This photograph of the Ginston home in Los Altos Hills was taken in 1950. Architect Joseph Allen Stein, who became very well known for the international style, designed this home. The home now is surrounded with beautiful gardens designed by Robert Royston, Mary Gordon, and the renowned Thomas Church. This early modernist structure became the home of Edward and Artemis Ginston and their family. Edward Ginston was a physics professor at Stanford and one of the founders of Varian and Associates. Artemis Ginston was a teacher and a community activist. Hello, I'm Nan Geschke, your host of the Los Altos History Show. Tonight we have as our guests Nancy and Ann Ginston, the daughters of Edward and Artemis Ginston. Welcome, Nancy and Ann. Thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah. Well, Nancy was able to share with me a book that your father wrote, autobiography, I guess, along with one of you, and I know that that he emigrated from Russia, with his family. What were some of those reasons why he decided to, why your father's family decided to emigrate from Russia?
Well, they came from Russia, or they left Russia primarily because of the war and the famine that was going on. My grandfather had originally come to the United States with his brother and father when he was a young teenager, and he'd worked in a bicycle factory in New York. And then later the family, as a group, the men of the group seemed to go to the Alaska and the gold rush, where they were involved in the Klondike. In a mine there. And they came back to San Francisco, where there was a name change from Ginsburg to Ginston. And then my grandfather ended up back in Switzerland, where he came across my grandmother on a train. She was also from the Ukraine and came from a kind of a gentler, less adventuresome family. But in fact, she had been exiled from Russia for political activities when she was a student. They met, got to know each other, liked each other, returned to Russia together, where they both went to medical school. My grandmother got her degree from the St. Petersburg University, and my grandfather got his medical degree from Tomsk in Siberia. Lenin died, and then they were starting into the Stalin purges. My grandmother and grandfather had lost 4 children already, and there were still 2 surviving at the time that they knew that they would have to leave. It was just a matter of time before either one of them was arrested, and then they would have been taken care of. My grandfather got a position on the Chinese railroad in Harbin as the medical doctor, knowing that they, on very short notice, could leave. She was a citizen.
So your father was, when they actually did come to the U.S., because your grandfather had actually lived here at one time, is that correct?
That is correct. They passed briefly through Korea and picked up a ship in Japan, passed through Hawaii, and then arrived in Angel Island in San Francisco in 1929.
So your father was how old, Ann?
You have to subtract 15 from 29.
Right. So he was about
13 or 14.
And he didn't speak any English, you said.
No, and he was put in 6th grade where he couldn't cope at all. So pretty soon he was a 13-year-old first grader for a while.
Oh, that must have been humiliating
I
for
think
him.
it was really hard.
Yes.
But soon he learned English, and he had excellent education in the San Francisco schools. In the vocational schools then, the Polytechnic High was wonderful for him.
So, and then he went on to Berkeley.
As an engineering student and a water polo player and a chess player.
So he was not only a student, but he was also a sportsman.
He was perhaps more of a sportsman than a student.
Oh, that's really interesting. So, Nancy, I understand that he met your mother while he was at Berkeley. Was she also a student there?
Yes, she was studying English and education, and they met and got married in 1939.
And when they were married, she was teaching, I understand, in Fresno.
Yes, she taught kindergarten in Fresno, and then they came to Stanford.
Where your father was a student, correct?
Right.
Right. So I understand that things were kind of tense around here, especially because we were on the coast in 1940. And there were quite a group of people that your father was associated with. And who were some of those people? They're familiar names to us now, but at that time, I guess they weren't so well known.
Well, his teachers were Fred Terman and Bill Hansen, and people he was working with were Russell and Sigurd Varian, who were very interested in inventing some way of getting radar. They certainly were concerned about the war. And
so Fred Terman, who is known as really the father of the electronic revolution here in the Valley, was his mentor, I understand.
yes.
And they, as a group, I guess without Fred Terman, decided to go as a group to New York, correct?
Yes, it was at the beginning of the war, and they were, instead of being drafted into the Army or Navy, the regular services, they were told to do research. And they were invited by Sperry Gyroscope to work in New York as a group, and they went as a group and worked as a group there.
And they also not only worked as a group, but they also lived as a group, or at least your parents lived with the Varians, didn't they? And who were very good friends?
Yes, they were very good friends all their lives, and they did live together. They thought of themselves as modern people, and they arranged each woman would have one day a week free of housework to play, go to New York City.
And you were born there, correct?
I was born there.
So Anne was born in New York, and your brother?
Leonard.
Leonard, okay. So the women would actually have a day off, which is, kind of a co-op daycare, or,
Yeah.
kind of ahead of their time in those days, in the 40s.
Yes, it was a communal household.
Uh-huh. So after the war, what happened?
Well, towards the end of the war, there had been discussion among Russ and Sig and my father about possibly starting a company named Varian Associates in California. They were all Californians at heart, and they were hoping to return. Bill Hansen returned to his position as professor in physics at Stanford University, and he offered my father a position as assistant professor in the same department, a position which my father was glad to accept.
So he became a professor of physics at Stanford, but he also is known as one of the founders of Varian Associates. Isn't that correct, Anne?
Yes, there were.
So he did both simultaneously, or?
Yeah, there were a group of maybe 10 or 12 people who started Varian.
Uh-huh. So I think we have a picture of that, actually, of the founders or the starters of the Varian and Associates. But you shared that with me, that the Varian brothers had
kind of a novel concept for their business. And do you want to share that with our viewers? Because I think that's interesting in light of what's happening now.
Well, Russell's idea was to buy a big piece of land and put a research laboratory in the center of it, then build lots of little houses around the outside for everyone to live in. And if there was money for research, if they had a contract, they would do research. If not, they would tend their orchard and chickens.
Oh, so they were covered on both ends.
Yes.
So if they were doing well with their contracts, then they didn't have to tend the chickens. But if they weren't doing so well, then they had to live off the land.
I hope they would tend the chickens anyway.
Somebody had to tend the chickens, right? So in terms of your father and his interests, I know that he was a scholar and a scientist and a sportsman, but he also was an amateur photographer, isn't that correct?
He was a very serious amateur photographer.
Mm-hmm. And
They're beautiful pictures.
Beautiful pictures, yeah. I think we have a few to show. And he also was an antique car collector?
He liked rebuilding Model A's, and there were three or four of them around at any time in various stages of repair.
Seems to be an inherited trait. There's A's around my brother's house.
Oh, is that right? Now, which brother is this?
This is my brother, the youngest brother, David, who's in Idaho.
Okay, so it's Ann and Leonard, Nancy, and David. Okay, so there were four of you all together.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And you were born in California?
Both David and I were born in Palo Alto.
In Palo Alto. So after they returned to California.
Yes.
And were part of that scene. So tell me a little bit about your mother now. We've concentrated a little bit on your dad and how important he's been, in terms of both not only Stanford but Varian and to the whole growth of the electronics industry here in the Valley. But I know your mother was a person in her own right and was very influential here as a community activist. And tell me a little bit about what her interests were.
Well, she felt that since she had been given the privilege of not having to work, that she needed to invest her time and energy back into the community in ways that weren't served by paid positions. Education had been important to her and continued throughout her life to be important. She was involved in schools, in the PTA, in the 4-H adult education she taught in. She felt that it was higher education, or actually education at all levels, was very important. She supported the public schools at all their levels.
And baked a whole lot of cupcakes during her career.
Yes.
Bake sales are always been important, right?
Yeah. While we were in elementary school, she went back to Stanford and got an additional a graduate degree as an educational specialist. By the time we were out of school, she was heading back towards earlier interests. In New York, she had done a lot of bicycling out of necessity, and youth hostels because they were available and affordable, and those were things that she started to get involved with out here. At first it was Los Altos Hills and the Trails and Pathway Committees, and then the surrounding areas, then the Santa Clara County, and then the state.
So she had a lot of interest, and I understand that she was a voracious reader.
She certainly was. She not only read standard good literature and theater, but she, in her library, had real collections of books on economics, race relations, histories, biographies. She was very widely read.
Read woman.
Absolutely.
Now I understand, Ann, that some of your parents' friends are legends now. For example, the Packards, I know, were friends of your family, David and Lucille Packard, and also the Stagners were neighbors, and of course the Varians too, who were business co-founders and so forth. Did you have that feeling that you were in the company of greatness as kids, or how did that all settle out?
Well, it was sparsely settled, the hills in those
Yes.
days. Neighbors were sort of few and far between, and there were a whole lot of legends. There was, I felt surrounded by legends. There was Martha Minnick. I don't know whether you remember Martha Minnick. Cy Abrams. Many colorful characters.
So they were just a part of your life then. Now I understand both of your parents were very politically active.
I think they could probably best be described as lifelong liberal Democrats.
With lots of capitals in there.
Yes. They believed in cluster housing, which doesn't exactly fit into Los Altos' hills
Scheme of things now.
absolutely, or then. And they believed in supporting living artists, education.
So really just, and were they active in the Democratic Party?
They
Slightly,
were
huh?
they were in New York. I think out here it was less Democratic Party than the activities that they believed in.
Now I know that your home, that the family home that we featured at the beginning of the show, and was designed and architected by Joseph Allen Stein, and I believe he was also became a friend and was a friend to the family. And what was he like? He's internationally known as a modernist.
He was a wonderful man, very gallant, wonderfully polite, very kind. And he gave us his dog when he left the United States. A beautiful collie.
And he left behind his drafting table, which we used as our dining room table for many years.
Oh, your
to
dining
come.
room table.
Yes, it was.
Oh, interesting. So when he went to India, he left his drafting table.
And his collie.
He left his practice completely.
So how much, how many designs were there before the actual home was finalized? Did your parents ever talk about that?
Several iterations.
There were several iterations.
They
Well-
joked that the only thing that they hadn't seen was a two-story house.
And it's not 2 stories.
No.
Yeah.
Well, believe it or not, time is up, and I want to thank you so much for joining us tonight and talking a little bit about your parents, Edward, and your mother, Artemis, a little bit about their life and their importance to us and in the history of Los Altos. And Nancy and Ann have been kind enough to invite me. I think Nancy's going to be giving us a tour through the home, and I hope you stay tuned for that interview. So thanks for joining us tonight, and keep tuned, because we're going to see that beautiful home. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Let's roll that tape. We're here with Nancy Ginston in front of the front entrance of the Ginston home. And I know, Nancy, that this home, or the land for this home, was once an apricot orchard, and that these buildings were architected by Joseph Stein. And we're just on the outside now and looking at some of the features of the home and why are they important to preserve. I know this home is now held by the Preservation Trust, a trust that your parents bequeathed to them because they felt it was important. So give us some idea of why these buildings are important to be preserved.
Well, my parents were real in love with modern architecture, modern art, modern whatever. And they chose Joe Stein as an architect because he did modernist work. And this was one of the earlier homes that was built. It's very much built to blend with the nature and the outdoors. It's single story, cement block, lots of windows, connections, overhanging eaves, a patio that goes directly from the, is connected directly to the house that makes it all feel as though the indoors, outdoors, one unit.
You certainly are struck by the setting of this home because of the maturity of the trees, for one thing, and the serenity of the environment here. You know,
It's true. It does have a very quiet kind of feel to it.
It does.
And even being out in the garden, it picks up on that.
I read just cursorily through the report that was done by the Preservation Trust about the spaces between the buildings as being very important to the overall sort of beauty of what we're seeing here as a modern structure. Do you feel that that's part of its charm?
I think the spaces are probably as important as the buildings itself. It was built as a unit. It was thought about always as a unit. And it was important that everything go together.
And I know that the garden is also a big part of this building and its surroundings. And I thought maybe we could take a walk into the garden and see for ourselves, you know, how the garden and the house work together. Shall we do that?
Sure, that sounds great.
Okay. We're standing here in the garden of the Ginston home, and Nancy, I'm struck with the majesty and the beauty of the trees that are here. It looks like a lot of them have been here for a long time. Were they part of the property or part of the original landscape architect's plan? Tell us a little bit about this garden.
Well, the garden and the house were carved out of an apricot orchard, so everything you see, my parents are responsible for. The elm trees are part of the original Royston garden and used to blow over in the winters with every severe storm, and spent a good part of their youth propped up. The oak tree and the ginkgo came a little bit later, and they were originally part of, in among a hedge, as a lasma hedge. And once the hedge was cleared back with the church garden, they really took off and have been very happy.
And I know that there are some sculptures on the other side of the garden. And who were those sculptures? You know, I know your brother is a sculptor. Are they his?
No, these were actually done by a woman artist by the name of Florence Swift. And I believe that she may be a San Francisco artist. She's certainly within the Bay Area. My mother had seen her work and was interested in having some. And in fact, the fence was designed specifically for the pieces.
Mm-hmm. So Royston actually designed the original garden, and then Thomas Church did an additional garden, or came in and changed some parts of the garden?
He changed a number of parts. He did an overlay. Royston had been one of the students who came through his office, and Church always had loved what Royston had done and had refused twice to remodel the garden, but at my mother's insistence, or I guess persuasion, he finally did come back, and there are parts of the garden that are left. The other side of the house around the kitchen where the birch trees and the circles are, that's very much a Royston. Mm-hmm. The field stonework and this patio design and the pathways that go around, those are Churches. So it's a very nice blending of the two.
Styles.
Landscape architects, yeah.
So it's probably time to go in and see what we can see on the inside.
Okay.
Now, Nancy, I noticed now that we're on the interior of the home that actually the exterior is brought into the interior with these concrete walls. Was that a distinguishing mark of Joseph Stein's work?
Well, I'm not sure that it was a distinguishing mark of his work in general, but materials were important, and he did it in this house and also the house that he designed and my father and his father built next door.
The cement floors are very attractive. Have they been here since the beginning?
They were part of the original design, and originally the entire house had the cement slab floors with the grid design.
And I know on the other side of this wall is a beautiful fireplace that I think was one of your family's favorite places to gather, correct?
Yes, actually we spent many nights gathered at the fireplace, and it has a beautiful marble above it.
And I know that the furniture here is not the furniture that was your mother and dad's. I think we have a picture that we're going to superimpose on this scene now to kind of show, you know, what the living room really looked like when your family lived here.
Yes, actually the couches were built by my father, designed and built by him.
Now I noticed these cabinets behind us are very attractive, and the wall divider you said was original to the house?
Yes, it was called the teakwood cabinet, and it was part of the original house, and it's always been in use.
And it was designed by Joe Stein too?
Yes, it was.
So very, very beautiful and very, very attractive. Now, as far as the dining room, that was an addition, correct?
Yes, it was.
Yeah. And that was done in what, the late 50s or early 60s?
I believe it was done in either 1959, no, probably around 1959, 61, somewhere in that area.
And the very attractive part of the dining room, do you feel enveloped by the environment around it, the outdoor garden. But the internal feature of the soffit is one that is beautiful, and I understand that these two rooms, the living room and the dining room, are two rooms that will not be able to be changed. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. You also mentioned that your mother and your father were very interested in geography, and that you had maps in locations in the house, and there's one that still remains.
That's correct. We have a map of North and South America. They're plastered to one of the walls in the hallway.
So are you a wonderful geographer?
I'm a terrible geographer. I know nothing unless I've seen it in person.
So all those maps really didn't have
They did not sink into my head.
I think it's a marvelous idea of really sort of trying to allow. I would love to have them in my own house now, just to make reference.
Actually, I wouldn't mind having a map that's down the hallway at this point either, but it's firmly attached, and I think there's no chance of getting that. There are also maps of Europe that used to be on one of the walls that has now been covered over.
Well, I want to thank you, Nancy, and also to your sister for participating in our Los Altos History Show. I hope that you had a good time, and we certainly have, learning about your parents and learning about your family life and your father's work and your mother's interests, as well as seeing this beautiful environment that they built for for themselves and for your family, which is going to live on. That must make you feel really, really good, I would imagine.
Yes, it does. It was a very nice house area to grow up in, and we were fortunate in having that opportunity.
Right. Well, thanks for being on the show with us, and thank you, viewers, for watching the Los Altos History Show. We'll see you next time.